Nothing happened when the message was sent. No alarms went off. No meetings were called. No one stopped what they were doing. It arrived the way most warnings do. Quietly, typed, filed, logged. The person who wrote it didn't sound panicked. They weren't predicting disaster. They were documenting something that didn't look right, a detail that didn't fit, a pattern that felt off. They sent it up the chain the way they were trained to, and then they waited. Days passed, then weeks. The system kept working. The routine held. Everything looked normal enough, which is why the warning never became urgent. By the time anyone realized what that message meant, it was no longer a warning. It was evidence. At the time, there was no reason to panic. Normal had a rhythm. Shifts began the same way. Reports were filed the same way. Numbers were checked, approved, and archived. Nothing about the system felt fragile. It had survived minor failures before. Small issues had surfaced, been corrected, and forgotten. That history mattered because every past recovery reinforced the same belief that the system could absorb stress without breaking. Problems were framed as deviations, not warnings. And deviations were something experience could manage. So when the warning arrived, it didn't challenge confidence. It fit inside it. The system had been running for years, long enough that small irregularities were expected, documented, logged, moved past. People trusted what they could see and what they could measure. Numbers stayed within acceptable ranges. Performance remained stable. Deadlines were met. The warning didn't predict collapse. It didn't demand immediate action. It suggested caution. And caution is easy to postpone when nothing appears to be breaking. Failure was familiar, but it was never expected. Years of experience and research had convinced people that a few warnings could be ignored as long as the system was being followed. That the warning was looked at, but it wasn't seen. It was treated as something to be mulled over, another report among many. They had seen warnings like this before, so this one blended in. Nothing changed afterward. Nothing changed afterward. And that decision was never announced. No one said, "We are choosing not to act." Inaction didn't look like a choice. It looked like continuity, the same meetings, the same schedules, the same expectations. Each day that passed without incident felt like confirmation, not that the warning was wrong, but that it could wait. And waiting slowly became policy. No one wrote that down. There was no document that said, "We have decided to wait." It happened gradually. One unanswered email, one postponed discussion, one assumption that someone else was watching closely. Inaction didn't feel dangerous. It felt responsible. No procedures were adjusted, no schedules rewritten, no one was told to stop. The system continued exactly as it had before. Meetings came and went. Checklists were completed. Work carried on. If the warning came up at all, it was framed as something to revisit later. There was always something more immediate to deal with. Eventually, there were no more dates to push back to. Slowly, problems began to surface. Small at first, then harder to ignore. And yet, with a deadline approaching, it somehow became harder to notice them. The familiar drone of the workday persisted until it didn't, until it was replaced by klaxons, a sound that cannot be dulled. Warnings fail in a specific way. They arrive before people are ready to believe them, too early to feel urgent, too quiet to interrupt momentum. They don't demand action, they suggest it. And suggestion is easy to delay when routines are working and consequences feel distant. By the time a warning feels obvious, it has usually lost its power. Not because it was wrong, but because belief arrived too late. This is how systems collapse, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, one ignored message at a time. Only then did the warning resurface, not as a question, not as a debate, but as a record, a line in a report that now read differently, a message that no longer suggested caution, but consequence. Dread replaced confusion as one truth became clear. The time to correct the errors had already passed. If the report represented a chance, the warning represented an outcome, not a consequence born of negligence, but of inaction. This would no longer be reviewed quietly among peers. It would be examined publicly. In hindsight, the warning was not a caution. It was the moment the timer started, and the only thing waiting at zero was catastrophe. At the time, the warning didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't ignored out of arrogance. It wasn't dismissed out of carelessness. It was weighed, discussed, and ultimately delayed because nothing had failed yet. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off. 73 seconds later, the mission was lost. In the aftermath, the warning resurfaced, not as speculation, not as caution, but as proof. This was Challenger, and this was the warning that wasn't urgent.